Good evening, I'm Melisa Idris.
And I'm Sharaad Kuttan.
Welcome to Consider This, the show where we want you to consider and then reconsider the news of the day. Now, of course, the biggest news has been the inquest on fireman Adib Mohd Kassim's death. So after a 41-day inquest, the coroner's court has now ruled that Adib's death was the result of a criminal act, saying that blunt force trauma was to his chest was not caused by an accident. So what does this tell us after so long, so many days of an inquest?
Well, Melissa, there's also the additional point, which I think sometimes gets lost in the media report, which is that the SOPs around the police managing a riot situation also called into question. The police were asked whether they, got there in time and so on and so forth. The IGP has in fact responded by saying he thinks that the SOPs might not themselves be a problem, but he's going to look at whether the police follow those SOPs.
Yeah, I think after so many days, you have to remember that the incident happened 10 months ago, and then we had this 41-day inquest. Now, even after so many days, there are still so many questions that remain. I mean, who is going to be held accountable for this? Who is going to be charged for this murder? What we do know is the fact that the coroner's court has ruled that it was perhaps 2 or more persons that were involved in Adib's death.
Right.
But who will be held accountable?
Right. So the inquest could not identify the assailants, but so it's left up to the police, I guess, at this point in time to pursue that investigation. We also note, I think, that around Adib has been quite a bit of political mobilization, and I think for observers the question is whether there's going to be kind of political, action around this, whether in fact some people are going to be trying to make political capital from the inquest, whether the result has been in their favor or not, as some people put it. The larger issue of the temple and its relocation and the emotive politics around that also remains, I think, for Malaysia, one of those issues that needs really careful attention.
Yeah, and I have to say, if you remember when this happened, right, it brought our country to the brink of racial unrest. It was such a tense time. Now, I have to say, after all this, with the ruling of the coroner's court, what have we learned from this lesson? Because the ruling is such, but it still leaves all these questions unanswered, and we still want to find out what happened. But at the end of the day, with the kind of this situation, what have we learned from this incident?
Well, Melissa, I think that we'll come away learning that Malaysia, to a large extent, respect processes, and there was a due process, and I think that was carried out to the best of the abilities of the authorities concerned. But because there are some people in the country who are intent on mobilizing around issues of race and identity, that these moments become flashpoints.
Right.
Rather than just looking at this tragedy as a tragedy of an individual who was hurt in a riot, it has become a question of mobilizing identity politics. So have we moved on from identity politics? Perhaps not. The rest of the world hasn't.
Definitely.
Will we be able to ourselves?
Exactly. And speaking about the rest of the world, as we wrap up the week, let's do a quick follow-up of some of the biggest stories of the week. Now, in the US, of course, the biggest story there has to be the beginning of the impeachment inquiry by Nancy Pelosi, the Speaker in the US House of Representatives. And then now we have a US media report saying that the whistleblower whose complaint has led to that impeachment inquiry against Donald Trump is in fact a CIA officer. This according to the New York Times, the Washington Post, as well as Reuters. So all of these news agencies confirming that the whistleblower did in fact work in the White House.
Yeah, so I think what interests to perhaps audiences, as it were, to the American drama, the American political drama, is that Donald Trump has come close to being impeached, and on many other occasions, questions into the way in which he relates to foreign powers and the American system that, in fact, criminalizes such relationships. So we see another instance of it. This time it seems like Donald Trump might, in fact, be sent, as it were, into the dock to answer questions. Now, that impeachment process might or might not lead to his conviction. In the case of Bill Clinton all those years ago, Melissa, remember, he was involved in an impeachment process. He was not found guilty and so did not resign.
Well, okay, so with the US, I'm not sure what's going to happen next, whether this inquiry will move forward, likely in the House of Representatives, where the Democrats hold a majority, whether it will get blocked in the Senate, where the Republicans hold a majority. But at the end of the day, what we will be watching closely as media commentators will be the sentiment of this, because as we head into the 2020 elections in the US, what will this mean for Republican candidates, for Donald Trump as a Republican candidate, I guess, looking for re-election? Could he stumble at the ballot box and make it, given the sentiment of the US citizens there?
Yeah, Melissa, of course, I think I've said this many times. I have no skin in the game in terms of American politics. But to the extent that the leader of the largest power in the Western Hemisphere, and the fact that Donald Trump has been so disruptive to many ways in which international relations are governed, his fate and the fate of his successors, I think, are very interesting for us to watch.
Well, closer to home, Indonesia was also in focus this week. Now, for days, Indonesia has been rocked by student protests against a new corruption law and plans to revamp the draconian criminal code. Now, the latest news is that an Indonesian student has died from a chest wound, and this as riots erupted in Kendari city on Sulawesi. So this is the first fatality.
Yeah, the first, and there's also another student in critical condition. Students reminding the Indonesian government of its promise to uphold democracy, a promise they made 20 years ago, and for largely they have delivered on. The framing of the story, very interesting. In some Malaysian media has framed very narrowly around the question of premarital sex, the law to criminalize premarital sex. Of course, that is a huge affront to fundamental liberties in the individual in any democracy.
But it's so much more than that, isn't it?
It is so much more than that. In the fact that the anti-corruption agency of Indonesia was going to be weakened after stunning successes these last 2 decades, also perhaps a very serious charge against President Joko, only newly re-elected. He's come out, in fact, to defend his commitment to democracy. But as they say, the proof of the pudding is in the eating. So if Jokowi does not deliver, and he panders to partisan groups within the assembly, the DPR, we'll see how this all pans out.
Okay, so one thing to remember, though, while the most, I guess, the headline-grabbing issue is the proposed ban on extramarital sex, but remember, the protests go far beyond that, and we will be keeping a very close eye on what's happening there in Indonesia. Now, coming up in just a couple of minutes, we're going to be speaking to the organizers of the global climate strike here in KL, so make sure you stay tuned to consider this.